You might know the name, you might not. Several years ago, several decades now actually, he was very famous in religious circles. If I understand it correctly, he would often open for Billy Graham revivals in large cities. His name is Charles Templeton, and his reputation began to grow, and many people thought that he was going to be a more powerful speaker than Billy Graham, was actually going to kind of take over the crusade deal and be the man who was the primary speaker for those. You probably have not heard of him because that never did happen. And the reason it didn't happen is because in his book, Farewell to God, he explains why he left those revivals and stopped doing them, stopped being a part of anything religious. It says he was sitting somewhere one day and he picked up a magazine, I think it was a National Geographic, and he saw on the cover of that National Geographic a woman who was holding her child. This was in the 90s, as I recall, and I think it was during the drought in Ethiopia. And the woman was holding this child, and the child was emaciated and was literally starving to death. And the woman was looking up into the sky, and basically on her face was the question that Templeton had. And that question was, why? You see, her child was dying of starvation. And all that she needed to keep her child alive was food. And all she needed for food was rain. And she was looking up into that sky that had no clouds and offered no hope of any rain, asking herself, why? Why doesn't it rain? And as Charles Templeton was looking at this picture, he thought, well, who's supposed to be in charge of the rain? God? And God's supposed to be a loving God? And if God were a loving God and all that Ethiopia needed was just a little rain, then why doesn't God send the rain and save this woman and save her child? And why? And so he said, he came face to face with that idea of the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. And he said he just could not believe in a God that will be a loving God, that will be an all-powerful God, who would allow the kind of pain and suffering and death that we see in this world. I think if most of us are honest, we have had times at least where we have asked that question. God, why is this happening? Why did this person die in the car accident and the drunk driver who hit her didn't? Why did this lovely Christian mother die and the drug dealer down the street is making money hand over fist and living how he wants? Why did this 4-year-old little boy suffer and die from cancer while this very corrupt businessman is a billionaire? Why? You see, we understand the problem, don't we? In the 3rd century BC, a philosopher by the name of Epicurus put it like this. He said, if there are these 3 ideas, these 3 propositions, there's a loving God who's all-powerful and evil and suffering exist, then one of those 3 cannot be true. Either God is all-loving, but he doesn't have enough power to stop the suffering and pain, or God is all-powerful, but he doesn't really love you and he doesn't really care, or there's not a God who is all-loving and all-powerful. And the reason that we see the pain and the suffering and the evil that exist in this world is because there's no loving, all-powerful God. You know, the British playwright Oscar Wilde said you can walk down any given street on any night in London. And this was several decades ago. And he said you can see enough pain and suffering to know that God doesn't exist. In 2009, I debated a man by the name of Dan Barker, and in that debate and in his previous writings, he had said, all you have to do is walk into a children's hospital and see the pain and suffering that they go through, and you can know for sure that God does not exist. In 2014, I debated a man by the name of Bart Ehrman, who is a professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, who wrote a New York Times best-selling book called God's Problem. And in that book, Ehrman says the problem with the Bible and the God of the Bible is it doesn't answer our most pressing question, why do people suffer? It's a good question, isn't it? Why are things not right in the world? Why do children get passed many times from one home to another home in a foster care system, and sometimes they end up with people who are basically taking care of them but physically or emotionally abusing them? Why does that happen? Hopefully that's an exception, but it does. Why are children in African nations, especially the young boys, taken at the ages of 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and forced to shoot their relatives, and then they become members of these rebel armies? Why? There's something wrong with the way many things seem to be. And so we come to this idea, the problem of evil and pain and suffering, and we ask, if there is a loving God, why does He allow these things to happen? Now, ironically, the fact that there is something wrong actually, ironically proves that God does exist. And what I mean by that is, from a philosophical standpoint, if there were no God, if atheism were the case, if humans were just products of natural processes over millions of years, then we wouldn't expect things to be right. There'd be no right. In fact, however the situation was however it would be. There'd be no correct way for things to go. There'd be no justice. There'd be no injustice. There'd be no moral right. There'd be no moral wrong. The idea that a child was getting beaten by a foster parent wouldn't be wrong. It would just be what it is. You see, the fact is, deep down, every single one of us knows that something about the situation seems unjust. C.S. Lewis understood this perfectly, and in his atheism, he basically was accusing the world of being an unjust place. And then it dawned on him. And he said, where had I gotten this idea of justice? He said, if there's no God, the idea of justice makes no sense. And so I could do one of two things. I could say there's no real justice and it's just a private fantasy, making it up, and that's how I want it to be just because I like it. Or I could say there is justice, and what's going on is unjust. He said, you don't call a line crooked if you don't know what straight is. And ultimately, he said, atheism was too simple. It just didn't account for justice and injustice, which I knew existed. And so the fact of the matter is, just from a philosophical standpoint, you can really defeat this idea of pain and suffering and evil in a very short logical syllogism. It's really simple. As ironic as it is, it's an age-old question, but here is how it was put by William Lane Craig, and it makes perfect sense. If objective moral value exists, God exists. Evil exists. Evil is an objective moral value. Therefore, God exists. Now, in one way, philosophically and intellectually, you can answer the problem of pain and suffering just exactly like that. It's done. You don't have to go further. If there is anything that actually is unjust, then there has to be a God. You can stop right there. However, that doesn't really take care of the whole situation, does it? Because we know that many times we can answer something intellectually, but from an emotional standpoint, there still seems to be something else we need. We still need to understand this on a level of Well, on a level of how could a loving God do this? How could a loving God allow this? So let's see if we can build a case that will help us understand the emotional side of the challenge of pain and suffering. Number one, let's make sure we understand what the Bible actually teaches. Does the Bible teach that God is love? Some people have tried to argue that it doesn't, because they have come into contact with this argument and they have tried to work it out in their minds, and they've given ground on this idea that God is love. Does the Bible teach God is love? Absolutely, positively. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. He who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. That's a fact. Does the Bible teach that God is all powerful? That God can do anything that takes power? Absolutely, positively. You go to Genesis chapter 17, and Abraham, addressing God, says that he is Almighty God. In the book of Job, the text says that nothing that God wants to do can be withheld from his hand. Does the Bible explain to us that God is all powerful? Yes. So is there a loving God? Absolutely. Who is all powerful? Yes. So how then is it the case that there is pain and suffering in your life? And here's how. Many times we have misunderstood why we are in this world and what the idea of love means. You see, we have equated the concept of love with comfort, with blessings from a physical standpoint. Many times our idea of love is someone who gives us what we want or what we ask for. And that's what we think love is. You know, that's not the biblical concept of love. The biblical concept of love is doing what is spiritually best for another person. Was it loving when God, through Jesus' message to the Pharisees, said, "You hypocrites, you brood of vipers, you always reject the will of God for yourselves"? And was that loving? It was loving. What did those Pharisees need at the time? They needed somebody to make sure they understood they were going in the wrong direction. When the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what good thing do I need to do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus looks at him, and the text in Mark chapter 10 says, "And he loved him." You know, lots of times our society now would say, well, if Jesus loved him, here's what Jesus should have done. Just accepted whatever he was doing, just gave him a big old hug and said, "Hey, you don't need to do any more. You're already excited about the Lord's work." No. What the text says, he looked at him and loved him and said, "One thing you lack, go and sell everything that you have and give it to the poor, and come and follow me, and you'll have treasures in heaven." Jesus loved him enough to tell him the truth. You see, I think most of us, well, and I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say that because I think many people in this world believe that they have a deal with God, and that deal is, as long as God takes care of them how they think they need to be taken care of, they will obey and do God's will for the most part. And what they mean by that is that means I need a nice car. That means I need clothes that I like. That means I need a job that I think is good and one that supplies me and my family with the kind of stuff that we want. Need probably 2 weeks of vacation every year and, a raise periodically, and need to make sure that my health is good and I have kids who are above average in looks and intelligence and athletic ability, and I need to make sure that I grow up, that my kids grow up and have grandkids and I get to see my grandkids. And, it's almost like we feel like we're God's pets, like we're his little hamsters. And my son's got a little hamster. It's a cutest little hamster. You can pick it up. This is for the first time. I've had hamsters for years. This is the only hamster I've ever had that acts like it actually likes people. I used to have a hamster named Hamlet, and that hamster would get you, and if you picked it up, he would bite you and did not want to be held. This one is a cute little gray and white. It's called a winter white hamster. And when you go to the little cage, it pops its little head out and acts like it likes you. You can pick it up and pet it. Super cute. Now, my son takes great care of this hamster. He makes sure it's got food, makes sure it's got water. He buys these little treats, these little yogurt treats at the pet store that are like little drops of some kind of yogurt, I don't know. And he feeds this hamster. You know, I think lots of times we just kind of feel like we're God's pets. And that it's God's job to keep our cage clean and give us plenty of food and every now and then drop us a yogurt treat in. And as long as he's doing that, then we're good with how things go. But the point at which something happens to us that we don't expect, we're 43 and we go to the doctor and he says, we found something and we need to talk to you about it. The point at which something happens to us that doesn't fit in our idea of how things should go, we then say, God, what's the problem? Why? Why'd you do this? Now, from an atheistic standpoint, you can understand why they think that way, and here's why. Because if you don't think that there's anything after this life, then this physical life is all you've got, and it's the only place where justice can be served. And you and I both know from a creation standpoint and from a spiritual standpoint and a Christian perspective that if in this life only we are expecting justice and things to be made right, will we ever see that happen in this physical life? It's not going to happen. We know it will never happen. And so if this life is all you got and you're expecting things to be made right in this life, it's not going to be made right. Things are going to be messed up in this life until. Well, they're going to be messed up because of the sin that was brought into the world by Adam and the sin that each one of us who have reached the age of accountability has continued to cause to increase. Until when? Well, until sin and death are destroyed ultimately. And so if we think that this physical life is all that we've got, of course we're going to be disappointed. Of course we're going to see things as messed up. Of course we're going to say it's all crooked. But see, if you recognize that there's something more than this, something after this, something better than this, where everything will be made right, well, you see, that perspective makes all the difference. It's very much, in my mind, like a person maybe who has not been introduced to modern medicine, especially maybe not modern surgical procedures. I was just reading a book. I was listening to it actually on tape. It's called Lost in Shangri-La, and it's a book about some people who were flying a plane in World War II over this particular jungle area, and their plane crashed, and they landed on the top of this mountain. And the top of this mountain was inhabited by several tribes of cannibalistic natives. And they got there and they realized that they were only cannibalistic in the sense that when they would fight each other and the other tribes, then they would kill the other tribes and things. But outsiders, they had hardly ever even seen. And so when they come into this untouched native group that haven't had any influence from the outside world, they didn't understand what guns were. They thought that the planes were some kind of birds flying over. They didn't understand any of it. But imagine being in that kind of situation and a person introducing you to a doctor and saying, this doctor really cares for you. He wants what's best for you, wants what's best for everybody in this place. And then later they see that doctor with a mask on standing over a person, and the person's chest cavity is cut open, and the doctor is literally holding that person's heart. Does a tribesperson who has no idea about modern medicine and surgery come to an incorrect conclusion about what's going on in that surgery? This person grew up fighting other people as a cannibal. What does he think's going on? Well, number one, he thinks this person's absolutely dead. And number two, he thinks the person standing over him who's holding his heart is his sworn enemy for sure. Now, my uncle was hit by a car when he was 8 years old. He was supposed to be dead before he was 20. He's 61 years old now, has the heart of a 26-year-old. He had heart replacement surgery. He has a 26-year-old's heart now, and he's doing terrific. Had it for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, I think. To make that happen, you literally have to cut a person open and take their old heart out and put a new one in. If you're watching from a perspective that that heart is all he's got and the doctor is holding it, what do you think that doctor thinks about the person laying on the table? Hates him, trying to kill him, murder him, etc.? If you don't know there's a post-operation, if you don't know that this happens because we want this person to be better, then you have a complete misunderstanding of what's going on. You see, if you don't understand about a future spiritual existence, then you can never, ever understand why God allows pain and suffering in this world. But if you do understand about a future eternal spiritual existence, then while you might not like the stuff that happens to you or others, you can put it in a perspective of it having some type of value. Now let's look at that idea of not liking it. And I want you to listen to this statement. And I think most of us understand it intuitively, but it needs to be made. God cares much more about your holiness than He does about your happiness. I'm going to repeat it, and let's unpack it. God cares much more about your holiness than He does about your happiness. You see, we think God cares the most about how happy we are, but He doesn't. He cares the most about how holy we are and about how prepared we are for eternity. That's why when you go to James chapter 1, James explains to us, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Now, what's he say? Count it all joy when you fall into various trials? Why in the world would you count it joy when you fall into hard times? When you look at that word trials, that is not when you decide you're going to do an extra 5 minutes on the treadmill. No, that is pain in your life that is sometimes caused by, in James's time, and especially 1 Peter, 2 Peter, in James's time was caused by governmental officials persecuting the Lord's church. Pain caused by death of a loved one, caused by separation of various kinds. That is real trials. Sickness, disease, death. So James says, count it joy when you fall into various trials. Yeah, because there's a big difference between joy and happiness. You see, happiness is when things go the way you think they should. Happiness is when you get up. It's when you get up. Let's say you're a 16-year-old. You just turned 16. It's your 16th birthday. You come down the stairs and your dad says to you, hey, you're 16 today. I wanted to buy you a new truck. Here are the keys. You look at the keys and it says Ford, and you open the door and you look out and there's a new Ford Raptor sitting outside in the driveway. A Ford Raptor is about an $85,000 vehicle. It's your dream vehicle. You now have a brand new Ford Raptor. Your mom said, oh, hey, it's your 16th birthday. I wanted to fix you a birthday breakfast. And you go to the table and it's all you can eat bacon. I mean, this is a happy birthday, I mean, it's like the 24-ounce pack of Wright Applewood smoked bacon. You get to eat it all. You don't have to share it with your siblings, nothing. Oh, and then you go to school and the teachers say, oh, it's your birthday. You know what? I'm going to give you 100 on every test today, and you don't have to do any homework for the rest of the week. Oh, and then it just happens to be that your team is in the basketball state championship. And you normally don't even get to start very little playing time most of the time, but the coach says, hey, it's your birthday. We're going to let you start tonight's game. And you start and you score 37 points. And your team is down by 2. You're going across half court with 3 seconds left. You put up a half court desperation shot. It's your birthday. You hit it. It's a 3-pointer to win your team's first state championship in the history of your school. You happy today? Yeah, you're happy. Could a person who doesn't have a relationship with God and have no concept of a future eternal destination be happy on a day like that? Yeah. Could they have joy? No. Because joy is an understanding of your right relationship with God. That is joy. It's not affected by outside circumstances. It's like in my mind how I always illustrate it is the top of the ocean where the storms and the wind and the rain hits and the waves get big. Well, it's affected by the weather every single day. But the bottom of the ocean floor that's 5,000 feet down, you know, those storms hit the top of that ocean and they cause huge waves and that rain batters the surface of the ocean. But 5,000 feet down, it doesn't matter what's happening on the surface. The bottom of the ocean stays calm and serene. You see, on a day like that, anybody could be happy, couldn't they? That's happiness. Now let's say you wake up the next morning, you're feeling terrible. You hear your alarm go off, you reach over to hit it, and a pencil was on your desk, and you hit it, and you slam your hand right on the sharp part of a pencil. That causes you to jerk it back, and you knock yourself out of bed. Oh, and something was laying on the floor, and you fall over and break your femur. You got a pencil through your hand, you just broke your femur, and you got the flu. There's a terrible storm last night. You look out, and there is a tree that has fallen over your Ford Raptor that you got yesterday, and your dad comes in and explains to you that he didn't have time to get insurance on it. It's gone. Oh, and by the way, you look on the computer at the news, and you see that one of the players on your team was ineligible, and so you didn't really win the state championship. The other team did because you had an ineligible player. Now you happy today? Are those some trials you're going through? You might not be happy, but can you still have joy on a day like that? Can you still know what your eternal destination is, even though your hand has been impaled by a pencil, you broke your femur, you don't have a truck, and the game last night didn't count for anything? Can you still have joy? Absolutely, positively. Count it all joy when you fall into various trials. You see, God cares more about your holiness than your happiness, because your happiness is up and down. And we understand that. How much does a coach, when he is conducting football practice, care about your happiness? Well, if you played any football, the answer, just like I heard right there, is none. You know what a grass drill is? Especially a grass drill. Let's say you're doing 2-a-days. You get up early and you do a 6 o'clock to 8:30 football practice, and then you come back that afternoon. Let's say it rains in between that, and it's in the middle of June. You're doing a 2-a-day. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but it's still burning up, 103 degrees heat index, and it rained before, and so now it's real humid. And a grass drill is when everybody lines up that's on the football team, and you're supposed to chop your feet, is what we call it, where you move your feet up and down as fast as you can, and then the coach blows the whistle, and you fall as fast as you can to the grass, and then you get up. And then you keep chopping your feet, and he blows again. You fall as fast as you can, you get up. It's kind of like a burpee, except you got a lot of pads on. And you're sucking in grass with a 104 heat index. And many a time on days like today, I've seen some of the guys just walk over to the side, vomit, and come back and keep doing their grass drills. You know, one time I raised my hand, I said, "Coach, this isn't making me happy." Of course, I didn't do that. I'd have had about 100 more grass drills to do. What if somebody did? "Coach, this isn't making me happy. You know, I'm just not liking these grass." Well, Kyle, you are not happy, Kyle? Well, what should be the case? "Well, Coach, really, I was hoping you would just let me go," and all of us really, but I mean, if you won't let everybody, just me, I'll go sit over by the Gatorade cooler and I'll just drink Gatorade. Oh, okay, Kyle, will that make you happy? Okay, how effective is it going to be for Friday night if the coach says, I'm sorry, I'm not making you players happy. Let's all just stop the rest of practice and go drink Gatorade for the rest of the time. Well, see, if Friday night is coming, then players' happiness on Tuesday is not the concern of the coach. Now, any good coach is concerned he doesn't want to overheat them and cause any legitimate physical problems. He's concerned about their health, but their happiness is not his concern. Their ability to function and perform well on Friday night is. Do you know what God cares about for us more than anything in this world? He cares about our holiness. And that is why Paul can say, though our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Oh, I think it's interesting when Paul says our light affliction. He says it in the same book where he describes what he means by light affliction. He says that in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, but in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, in about verse 22 and following, he says, 5 times I was beaten with stripes by the Jews, 40 minus 1. 39 times he was beaten each of 5 times. So you're looking at right at 395 stripes he received from the Jews. You ever been beaten with a whip? You know, I think a couple shots would put me thinking, God, I'm just preaching the gospel. I don't know why you're letting this happen to me. 1 or 2 times for sure. It happened 5 times from the Jews. You don't read about it all throughout Acts as far as you read about it a couple times, but you don't even get all 5 of them until you get to 2 Corinthians. Oh, and then 3 times he was beaten with rods. Something like a big dowel rod, a big piece of wood. That's what the Romans did to you because they didn't have rules that you could only get hit 39 times. So the Romans could just wail on you as much as they wanted to with these sticks. Oh, and 1 time he was stoned. You know, at what point in Paul's training do you think he looked up and said, God, I feel like I'm ready for Friday night? You know, after the 4th whipping, after the 2nd rod beating, just before that final stone hit him where everybody thought he was literally dead. But Paul said our light affliction is but for a minute. You know, there's another verse that I find almost unbelievable that Paul wrote to the Philippians in Philippians chapter 1. He said, do not be afraid of people's threatening of you, for it has been granted on behalf of Christ to you, not only to believe in his name. Okay, here's what you get to do. Not only to believe in his name, but also to suffer for his sake. You get to suffer for Christ? You see, the fact of the matter is, when you understand what you're doing here in this world, you understand suffering. And let's let Paul put it into perspective for us, and Jesus' example showed us this exactly. In Philippians chapter 1, you look down in verse, I think it's about 19, and he says, I know this will turn out for my salvation through your prayers and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, that with all boldness, as always, so now also, Christ may be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. Do you know what the point of your life here is? The point of my life? For God to be made bigger. You know, sometimes that could mean showing the world how a Christian dies of cancer at 28. Sometimes it could mean showing the world how a Christian gets beaten 5 times with whips and 3 times with rods and stoned and still has a good attitude about life. He said, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. What I shall choose, I can't tell. I'm hard pressed between the two. I've got a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. And knowing this, I know I'll remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith. He said, I might stay here and suffer a little longer. But the whole point of my life is for Christ to be made bigger. Had a friend of mine who worked at Apologetics Press with me when I first got there. We worked together, I think, for about 8 years. His name is Charles McCown. Charles McCown, very fun guy. He's about 10 years younger than me. Charles McCown was diagnosed with a brain tumor in September. Within 6 months, Charles McCown was dead. I have on my computer a quote from one of the last times he ever posted on Facebook. He's got brain cancer at age 32, somewhere around there. I don't know exactly, I don't remember. He's literally dying. And he says, do not cry for me. I am a Christian and I know where I am going. And I am excited about the prospect of seeing my Lord. Well, that's just not right. He's supposed to live to be 80 and have grandkids or God made big in his life, dying of a brain tumor in his 30s. You see, when we understand what we're doing here, we can understand why God lets us suffer. It's not that he wants us to suffer for suffering's sake, but if in your life, the suffering that you experience can help you understand the fellowship of Christ's sufferings and can make God look bigger in this world to one person, well, then shouldn't we adopt the attitude of Job? Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And understand that though our light afflictions, which are but for a minute, they're working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Now, the fact of the matter is, though, you can't say that if you're not a Christian. You cannot let suffering in your life have the meaning it needs to have if you don't have Christ in your life. If you have not obeyed God and you have not become a New Testament Christian, believing the story, believing the factual, historical events of the life and death and resurrection of Christ Jesus, if you have not repented of your sins, if you have not been buried in water baptism for the forgiveness of those sins and let Christ's blood come in contact with your sin and cleanse it in that watery grave of baptism, arising out of that to walk as a new creature, if you haven't done that, the tragedy of your life is not that you're suffering. It's that you are going to suffer in this life and you don't have anything waiting for you to make it